Transgender Ideology Literature in Elementary Schools. An open letter from a professor, researcher, and psychologist. Preface. The following article is an adaptation of an open letter sent by the author to the local U.S. elementary school administration on October 14, 2022, in response to the introduction of transgender literature in grades 2 and above, starting age 7, in the local U.S. elementary school attended by the author's children. Note: the adaptation is required to follow editorial guidelines and in order to remove personal names or identifiers of the school, teachers, and administration, to respect privacy, and to foster an open and respectful dialogue. The content of the letter has nevertheless been kept intact. All other notes will not be mentioned during this recording, but you will be able to read them in the original article, which will be posted in this video description. More specifically, children have been introduced to 3 books: I Am Jazz by Jessica Hertel and Jazz Jennings, Jacob's New Dress by Ian Huffman and Sarah Huffman, and Born Ready, The True Story of a Boy Named Penelope by Jody Patterson. As part of this, children have been asked to join discussion in class to talk about the contents of each book and other related literature. Of note, several meetings with the administration and the school board have followed, but no changes have been made to the administration and content of the literature presented to children, with the exception of parents' voluntary exclusion per direct request of their children from class time in which the books above and related new literature will be discussed in the future. Furthermore, these topics have also been discussed as part of a recent lecture the author presented at the Academy of Sciences of Rome with the title Science or Ideology? Transgender in November 2022. Thank you very much for your quick and detailed response to our concerns as parents. It is wonderful to hear that in class. Letter. Thank you very much for your quick and detailed response to our concerns as parents. It is wonderful to hear that in class, teachers read books on a variety of very important topics such as kindness, diversity, difference, acceptance, and many other which I fully support. I have absolutely no doubt that, regarding all of the above, we agree on all the basic premises and the focus on the overall respect, love, tolerance, education, and protection for our children. And I thank you for that. The only remaining issue, from my perspective as a parent, and more importantly from the perspective of the scientific fields I am involved in, is that the books discussed, in my personal and clinical judgment, do not align with the intent and expected pedagogical, social, and psychological outcomes of the ethics we all share. It is therefore necessary to at least provide some of the reasons why I feel this way. To keep this letter short and to the point, I will only make a few very brief references on the current research studies without the proper bibliographical notes which should otherwise be included in any scientific paper. Let us therefore examine the content. Again, not all of it, but selected sentences from each book, with my best efforts not to be biased in any way in the selective process. Book 1. I Am Jazz. In my judgment, the ethical premise of the book is to narrate the story of a child from a healthy perspective of love, self-discovery, acceptance, tolerance, and a proper fight against stereotypes, which could be potentially harmful to a healthy development. Of course, I do agree with these premises. However, already in the very first page of the book, the author quotes a child saying, "For as long as I can remember, my favorite color has been pink." If the intent of the book is to question certain gender stereotyping attitudes, starting with what in the US is usually perceived as feminine, the color pink, this might miss the point. Of course, a child is free to express whatever he or she feels is appropriate, and we should encourage this self-exploration. Unless, of course, our socially constructed assumption that pink is for girls only becomes an etiological factor in any clinical decision-making process to determine the sex of the child. This is possibly the central issue in all the books, presenting a decision of accepting versus rejecting a child's perception, definition, and ideation or identity of self solely based on perceptual narratives from the child without any references to the normally occurring process, itself predicated on examination of the tetrad, chromosomes, hormones, genitalia, and especially gonads, to which I should add, from a neurobiological standpoint, both the examination of neurotransmitters and the examination of neuroanatomical and neurofunctional elements. Attacking the application of these processes as biologistic is both incorrect and misrepresenting the scope and underlying mechanisms contained therein. As I claim throughout this message, I would certainly not expect a children's book to delve into the intricacies of electrobiochemical processes. However, to present the situation of parents deciding to accept or reject this type of claims from a child simply based on what the book describes as open, non-judgmental, caring attitude, as opposed to a sound, clinical, and scientific judgment, itself based on solid research and examination, is not only unhelpful to children, it can also be extremely dangerous. To continue with this analysis, the sentence quoted above is just an example, of course, and despite the fact that it is already concerning that this faulty deductive process is displayed on the first page, it is further corroborated in a negative sense by similar statements in the following pages, like, here are some of my other favorite things: dancing, singing, backflips, drawing, soccer, swimming, makeup, and pretending I am a pop star. Furthermore, there is another questionable cognitive merging. It has the idea, ethically acceptable, of allowing a child to dream, explore, and develop in a non-judgmental way, with a confusion in and of the child. The logical sequence that seems to be the subject of the experience described as both displaying behaviors that are deemed empirically verifiable, or at least being aesthetically, perceptually visible data, for instance, dancing and makeup, with a neurodevelopment, emotional, cognitive, and behavioral striving toward the poetic rehearsal and training toward the future, for instance, pretending I'm a pop star. These aspects in themselves are very problematic, as they present a situation in which the author literally confuses the logical premises and the deductive conclusion drawn therefrom. This is unfortunately a relatively common issue in the application of the scientific method. As scientists, we are less prone to have some confirmation bias. In fact, as the literature indicates, we might be just better at cherry-picking results which fit our worldview. But one would hope that the peer review process could help distinguish evidence-based facts from incorrect assumptions and interpretation. Moreover, I also want to point out the intrinsically incorrect assumption that there should be a disagreement or even an opposition between parents and scientists or clinicians. An example of this is found a few pages later. Quote, "At first my family was confused. They'd always thought of me as a boy." This is an extremely problematic statement. Talking about my clinical practice and teaching and research specifically, when I meet with the family members of my patients, I refrain from making any assumption of incorrectness in the way the parents understand their children. In other words, and at the risk of sounding too simplistic, bumper sticker messages such as "Mom knows best," "Mom knows what's best for the children" are correct. I'm saying this because that is what both the scientific literature and common sense clearly say. Of course, in cases such as difficult and problematic upbringing, trauma-related and/or provoking experience, verbal, physical, psychological, emotional, or sexual abuse, a clinician shouldn't assume that parents are always right about their children, as both the perception and parenting skills might negatively be affected by this. But a well-informed clinician should never assume, even in these cases, that the traumatic experiences themselves always fully delete any healthy parenting instinct. To be clear, in saying this, I am simply emphasizing how, in the absence of any other parameters, when both science and parental instincts agree, there should be very little room for a level of doubt, which could be extremely detrimental to the proper development of the child. But what about problematic issues raised by an extremist, intolerant, hyper-religious mentality at the basis of very poor decisions by parents which would ultimately harm their child? Should science and medicine speak against this as well in order to promote empathy, tolerance, and inclusion? Yes, of course, the process is the same. The initial premise, clearly demonstrated by the scientific literature, is that more often than not, healthy parents know what's best for their children, at least in such early developmental stages. Given my specific background, I would strongly emphasize that this should, generally speaking, be the rule under the proper development of the child's prefrontal cortex. And more generally, of the child's neuroanatomical structures, it has around the age of 19 on statistical average, given individual and sex-specific differences. So what if the parents' so-called intolerant perspectives are in conflict with science? I could certainly agree with what the Thomistic literature has had to say for centuries now about this. Quote, if there is a clash between your religion and your science, one of two cases is under scrutiny. Either your way of interpreting religion is wrong, or your way of interpreting science is. To use an example regarding this issue, a few pages later in I Am Jazz, we find, quote, I hardly ever play with trucks or tools or superheroes, only princesses and mermaid costumes. My brother told me this was girl stuff. From a logical standpoint, this could be indicative of a variety of premises and causes. I could list at least a few. The child is indeed a girl, and further psychological, psychotherapeutic, social, cultural, clinical, pharmacological, medical, surgical help in this very order might be needed. This could be extremely hard on parents who might feel discouraged, shocked, helpless in figuring out how to best help their children, but pretending that medical conditions beyond body dysphoria and body dysmorphia are not true is both unscientific and evil, with extremely detrimental effects for all children and adults suffering from it. And there are many other medical diagnoses, of course. This cannot and should not be ignored, ever. Of course, this is the interpretation presented in the book. It could be true, but a cognitive, logical, deductive process in terms of taxological and decision-making steps and processes to reach this clinical conclusion is completely ignored in the book. Of course, this book tells a story and it is not meant to be used and or viewed as a diagnostic manual. Making a clinical diagnosis in areas at the intersection of the mental and the physical is extremely difficult, and that's precisely why the manual we use in a clinical setting are called diagnostic and statistical, thus neither etiological nor ontological manuals of mental disorders, in the case of the US DSM. However, my concern with using this book in class is predicated upon the fact that without proper clinical and scientific training, which takes several years, not a few hours per semester, delivered to fully formed adults and not children, books like this could be misinterpreted by loving, well-meaning, open-minded, but medically, scientifically untrained, uninformed, or misinformed parents who might cause very serious damage to their children. Another possible interpretation. The child likes both trucks and mermaid costumes. No further interpretation needed. While this type of behavior is statistically uncommon, even when accounting for variables on the level of upbringing, education, sociocultural, or ethno-religious factors, boys can play with mermaid costumes and girls can play with trucks. This is healthy and should be welcomed as part of an appropriate development. To claim that only boys could play with trucks, and vice versa in the case of girls, is an attack on the healthy development of the child. It is unscientific and dangerous. Just as anti-scientific and dangerous is the claim that playing with trucks makes a girl automatically a boy. Another option. The child brothers told her that this was girl stuff because that's a general assumption. An assumption as evidenced by the consideration above, fully grounded in both science and empirical observation experience. Again, no further interpretation needed. Fifth example. The child's brothers told her this was girl stuff but did so in order to provoke and or offend Jess. Certainly a possibility. Read any scientific paper in these areas, or much better, literally ask any parent of siblings, and you find out that yes, siblings provoke and offend each other. In no way this behavior is indicative of the fact that Jess was not a boy and it is a girl instead. Last, interpretation. The child's brothers told her that this was girl stuff but did not do so in order to provoke and offend Jess. Jess' perception of this was incorrect. This does not make the child physically or psychologically ill. It is just a question of inappropriate interpretation of behavior and emotion, both internally and externally, as multiple fMRI studies and the literature in general indicate. Similar arguments could be made about many other sentences in this book. For instance, quote, "Whenever I went out, I had to put on my both clothes again. This made me mad." It could only be what the child actually says this is. The child does not want to put on boy clothes again. It makes the child mad. Any further interpretation, besides what is commonly perceived as a very common behavior in children in general at this developmental stage, it's not well-founded at this level. The same analysis in all these steps can be applied to all the following books. Thus, I will only reference it here and I will not repeat it below. Book 2, Born Ready, The True Story of a Boy Named Penelope. This book presents similar logical fallacies, circular thinking, and misinterpreted or misconstructed assumptions. To quote just a few, I can start with the very first sentence of the book. Quote, "I'm no ordinary kid, I'm a ninja." Again, another example of questionable cognitive merging of dreaming, exploring, and developing in a non-judgmental way with confusing messages. As in the previous book, this logical sequence that sees the subject of the experience described as both displaying behaviors that are deemed empirically verifiable and visible with their rehearsal and training toward the future. It has pretending, in the etymological sense of moving, tending, striving towards, more specifically stretching forth, and parametrically demanding, as in demanding that the other people recognize me as I want to be recognized, regardless and or at times in spite of external and verifiable factors. The quote is, "Transfer some of my ninja powers to help her understand." Of course, everybody has a right to view himself or herself in the best way he or she would like to see himself or herself. However, demanding that others do so could be empirically and experientially inconsistent. Basic example of this would be demanding to be called a teacher without the proper training, experience, and or expertise to do so. Of course, one might argue that the term teacher, similar to the term doctor, could be extended parametrically, metaphorically, and figuratively to define admiration of one's excellence in certain areas, regardless of the recognized and recognizable academic training and certifications, degrees, etc., demonstrating such excellence. Of course, recognizing this excellence is again predicated on the recognition by others, not oneself. In other words, I could claim to be the best psychologist ever, but if nobody else besides me recognizes this, it will make it a mistake, a false claim. Furthermore, even if this excellence were to be recognized by others, the selection process of this other group, just like design in a scientific study, should be subjected to scientific rigor to avoid selection bias in the subject selection itself. In other words, one could not appeal to excellence for excellence itself, as in the now common saying, eminence-based science is not evidence-based science. Now, these issues might create further confusion in parents who are actually doing their best to find the right group of professionals to help their child. Are we to reject any type of excellence just because it might be predicated on false assumptions? Are we to reject all medical, clinical, scientific, pedagogic training? Of course not. There are multiple situations where an appeal to authority is indeed the best option, particularly when such authority is exercised in an area which is to a very great extent foreign to us, to our experiences, and to our training. An example of this would be trusting your surgeon to perform surgery on your knee. A, because you are not a surgeon yourself and you do not possess the necessary training, clinical experience, and degree or board certification. And B, because the surgeon does not have to have the same experience as yourself, i.e., he or she does not have to have experienced similar medical issues in her knee or have had surgery performed on him for similar reasons. To clarify the second point, a professional does not have to be you to be helpful to you. In fact, in many cases, diversity or difference is power. A professional might see problems and issues which you might be completely unaware of. Of course, any professional could make mistakes, but one would hope that experience, training, and degrees could, at least to some important extent, vouch for the integrity and ability of such a professional. If this professional is then able to tell a person that what the person perceived as a problem of societal and or familiar acceptance and is claimed throughout the book is actually a physical or mental problem, this does not constitute an attack or offense or a crime. It is a tool predicated on verifiable truths, scientifically speaking, to help the person. To be blunter, in clinical settings, calling someone mentally ill, or more properly calling someone as affected by a mental illness, is not different from calling someone physically ill. The fact that a person, in our case a child, might struggle with certain identity issues, in this specific case sex-gender issue, and could be therefore labeled with a mental health disorder, it's not different than calling, as an example, a professional athlete with a knee injury someone with a physical disorder. I do not call the first person crazy or stupid or immoral or evil, etc., just as I do not call the second person weak or faulty or a loser, etc. I should always demonstrate respect, integrity, honesty, love, and tolerance. Let's restate this. If a doctor is labeling someone in a person's behavior as mentally ill, the doctor is not saying that the person is bad. Even in the most objectively assumed bad behaviors, a doctor refrains from calling the person bad, but will label the behavior bad. Of course, at times we all get so attached to a relatively small, though prone to increase in size, part of ourselves, such as a certain behavior, emotion, or thought, etc., that if someone else, even if qualified, calls that clinically ill, it might feel offensive. But it's neither an offense, nor a lie, nor an attack on our identity or self. It is simply a tool for healing. Not telling the truth might feel good in the moment, but it will ultimately create far more damage than either the child or to the parent could have possibly envisioned. Logically speaking, it would be the same as telling a person, if this feels good to you, it must be good for you. Of course, to some extent, we are our best therapists because being an expert means having had an experience, and we are the only ones who have lived in our bodies since birth. However, everything about us can get sick, including our self-perception, proprioception, minds, and bodies. This is why someone affected by a diabetes mellitus might be told not to eat meat or another piece of chocolate cake, despite the fact that it would feel so good to have another piece. What might be partially harmful at first could become life-threatening. And because of that, I should also not necessarily expect, wish, or want any doctor telling us how we should live our lives in terms of assimilating, flattening our true self to be just like everybody else, because we are indeed beautiful in our uniqueness. This is precisely why we should be free to be ourselves. I should be free to be me. This means that a caring, inclusive, well-trained, helpful, open-minded, nurturing professional should help me realize the beauty that is me, not telling me or agreeing with me with a belief at this stage that I will feel better if I will become something different than myself. This is not only not helpful, it could be extremely dangerous. One of the examples that I sadly encounter in some very hurt, broken, suffering patients at the beginning of their therapy is their full wish to die or to disappear from this world, to fade away in nothingness. If I try to convince them otherwise, they often perceive this as an attack, not dissimilarly from one who could call hate speech an infringement on personal liberty. Again, do not tell me how to live or end my life. My body, mind, spirit, identity, etc. My choice. My body, my choice. My identity, my choice. One could argue that, yes, it sure is, but as with any other choice, it could be misinformed. mistaken, confused, hurt, suffering. My job and my moral obligation are to go against what these patients might define as their true self at that moment and push them gently, openly, lovingly, beyond what they're able to see as a possibility at that time. Their very sense of self, their whole identity is mistaken. I should not simply agree with them to make them feel better in the moment, because this won't be the truth, it won't last, it is not what they need. And this is, again, a central issue. I confuse what I want with what I need. I confuse healing with relief. And this happens far more often and more intensely, plenty of scientific literature in this area, when we are suffering. And even more so if we do not want to admit to ourselves that we are suffering. And that one of the things we think could ease our suffering actually makes the suffering worse. This is the very nature of addiction. Confusing wants with needs has this effect. Telling someone that they are what they feel or think or behave as they are, or what they pretend they are, it's not healing, it's relief. And that is precisely why we should honor our teachers much, much, much more than we do in our society. Schools are indeed the extension of our family, in the best possible sense of the term. And teachers should be mentors, guides, because they are wonderful in what they do. They should make our children whole. Children should thus be accompanied, stimulated in a way to extract beauty and wisdom from them, not the other way around, which is what the book describes as optimal. Quote, "Well, Penelope, today you are my teacher." This is one of the most problematic parts of the book. It is masked as a nice, tolerant, generous, and warm way to see how truly wonderful and smart and empowered and sensitive and strong our children are, which is in itself a true and great thing, but it's actually putting enormous pressure on those children who seek, at times without being aware of this need, education, guidance, and role models. To utilize the same medical analogy, it would be utterly disheartening to see a surgeon telling a child in the operating room, "Well, Penelope, today you're my surgeon." Of course, children also learn by playing, role-playing, and make-believe. But there should always be a distinction between the person who does not yet have full mastery of the topic, above all if the topic is as complex as one's identity, and the one who does. Plus, if we have such huge respect and admiration for people like doctors who only see children on a less regular basis to address clinical issues, shouldn't we have even more respect and admiration for our teachers who literally see our children every day and help them grow, develop, and become who they really are? And again, just as the scientific literature is extremely clear about the fact that there is a wonderful, incredibly complex variation between how a man can be a man and a woman can be a woman, it is also extremely clear that pretending that simply because an individual might feel different or completely opposed to a certain society claims is the proper behavior for their own sex, this does not warrant the person having to be another sex. This aspect is at the center of the very last 2 pages of the book, where after presenting the quote-unquote ninja value of masculine strength as admirable throughout the narration, and despite the fact that this type of stereotyping could be harmful, Penelope still has to bow to the fact that in order to be recognized as who she is, she has to act as the opposite sex. 2 things come to mind in this context. The first, also a well-known fact in research for at least 50 years, is the fact that if I were to divide children in 3 categories, first category, children who are not liked or are hated by other classmates. Second category, children who are liked or loved. And third category, children who are neither liked nor hated. Categories 1 and 2 are often predictors of much better psychological outcomes than category 3. Rather than using harsh and unscientific terms such as this child is only looking for attention, that's why he or she is acting differently than the norm, we should actually truly understand what this means. It asks, children want attention. We need to make sure that the attention they want is the one they need. The other issue is much more complex. Although it's relatively easy to solve with the proper knowledge of neuropsychological aspects in conjunction with basic knowledge of historical and post-developmental linguistics. It is the issue of sex versus gender. I am more happy to address this in a different section, although let me also point out that the artificially constructed separation between these terms, together with a wide array of neologisms and derived adjectivization, is a phenomenon which does not have solid evidence beyond certain postmodernist poetic constructions. In truth, poetry and the arts in general can tell us much more profound things about ourselves than a laboratory exploration. However, to see the very biological origin of the term gender rooted in purely Indo-European etymology through gene, gene, coming from the Greek genetiko, and in genetics, genes, genome, genitalia, but also in genesis, gynecology, and even the very word for the creative sex, thus woman, gynaika, gena, etc., rather than trying to destroy the very origin and creative power of the term gender, we should honor the very beings who are the embodiment of creation itself, women. In this sense, gender is not only extremely related to the term sex, but is actually the very synonym in the area of mechanical physical activation or activity. In other words, if the dictionary definition of sex is, quote, gender or a state of being either male or female, the root is through the Latin sexus, itself connected with dividing, separating, or cutting. Therefore, adding any other descriptors of such identity, behavior, expression, etc., can help distinguish certain aspects of the way sex and gender manifest itself inwardly and outwardly, just as the concept of being green is distinguishable from greenness itself, and yet one cannot exist without the other. It's entirely defined by the other. Green can be a tree, a leaf, a book, a shirt, or the Green Mountain State. In any case, as evidenced above, adding more descriptors does not change the ontological or biological nature of the concept and its manifestation, epiphany, in such reality. Book 3, Jacob's New Dress. My analysis of this book will be the shortest, as most of the issues it presents are substantially equivalent and in some cases fully coextensive with the ones noted in the previous two books. In fact, most of the narrative focuses on what most professionals and parents would simply define as occurring within standards or normal behavior in children. And yet again, we are faced with the false premise that there is something narrowing, controlling, choking, moralizing, dehumanizing, labeling, ostracizing, or at least not individualistic, special enough about normality. The main character in the book struggles and succeeds in finding the repressive nature of what normal society imposes on Jacob, despite the repeated attempts of society to imprison Jacob in something he is not. Of course, all the topoi of standard literary narrative techniques are present, including the opponent, adversary, the bad guy, Christopher, who behave as, yet again, normal society, the expected bad kid, making fun of the main character. As expected, both mom and dad are surprised and puzzled by their son's behavior, especially because the book clearly claims to be against gender stereotyping, and yet fails to notice how the bad character relates to all the stereotypically male things, such as armor, dinosaurs, etc., while the good character gravitates to all the stereotypically female things. This is nothing new, as it's simply a binary reversal of the story of the previous book, except that the novelty in this book is to add some pseudo-historical unscientific claims about the societal norm which were predictors of these stereotypings. Oxymorons aside, there are sentences such as, quote, "Not very long ago little girls couldn't wear pants," a statement that only applies to such a minute part of history, something less than 185 years, in 5,000 years of Indo-European anthropological clothing and costume research. This part of the book is not too different from the embarrassing moment of certain claims made in the media that neckties are a sign of British imperialism, or the fact that blue jeans represent U.S. supremacy, despite that the very name of these items defines its origins outside of the U.S. And yet, some people seem to ignore that these garments represent the most autochthonous folklore piece of ethnic tribal clothing in that part of the world, Croatia, or Dalmatia. In the case of the necktie, cravatta, or Genova in Italy, in the case of jeans. Again, mom and dad are not depicted as necessarily bad, just unaware, uneducated. They do their best to make sense of the situation, but again, They mistake a psychosomatized confusion between trigger and trauma, between healing and relief, and they attribute the suspension of phenomenological symptomatology, i.e., Jacob has difficulties breathing, as an indication that they have to change their attitude toward things. Finally, a nice addendum to the recipe comes from the usual neologisms such as dress thing, and the grand finale with the confusion between plot and absence of a moral of the story. With Christopher yelling that because Jacob wears female's clothes, he is now part of the girls' team. Again, the reader is generally accompanied to believing this is an offensive statement, a mild form of hate speech. But the truth is that this is precisely the message of the book, the identical essence in ontological terms between an extracted display behavior and the identification of the stereotypical owner of the behavior, with new identity of the carrier. Of course, since the author, rather the authors, cannot escape their conditioned, society-induced, subconscious self, they still present the masculine archetype of the armor and its binary opposite. It has, quote, a soft, cottony, magic armor, of which the main character is proud of. A perfect script for an adult novel. For children, I would rather see more pedagogically sound literature. To conclude, my examination is by no means an attack or an empty criticism of the parameters, ideas, and overall thought process that the school, the administration, all the teachers, and all the staff put into including these books and other teaching materials in the curriculum. I share the exact same perspective, and I want to restate that I have full trust and admiration for what you do. I also believe that most of you might have acted and are still acting out of love, care, integrity, and honesty, and all of this is evident in the way you interact with each other and with the students. I simply want to shed some light on some of the darkest and dangerous aspects of this type of material, which without deep and solid scientifically informed analysis might be considered appropriate and educational, but contains far too many issues to be considered healthy for our children. Thank you.